Good day, economic students. Welcome back to our chapter on gross domestic product and our study of national income accounting. Quick review. GDP is a monetary measure of all final goods and services produced, not necessarily consumed, within the domestic borders of the United States in a year. Now, how much was GDP last year? GDP last year in 2016 was $18.5 trillion. We'll look at some actual GDP numbers soon, but GDP last year for 2016 was $18.5 trillion. So the United States produced $18.5 trillion worth of goods and services. So we already looked at what's measured, right? There's two ways to sum this all up, though. Okay, so if GDP in 2016 was $18.5 trillion, which is, that's a lot of economic activity, right? There's two ways to come to this number, arrive at this number, to what we would say add it all up. So GDP, right, in the middle here, right, we can either add up all of the money that's spent on final goods and services, we call that the expenditures approach, or we can add up the income that's generated from producing those same goods and services. A simple example usually helps clarify exactly what we mean by the difference between the expenditures approach and the income approach. Now remember, these are two sides to the same economic coin, if you will. That's a good metaphor for the idea we're trying to express here. So I go to the barber today. I actually did go to the barber. Bud the barber. I actually found out that Bud's closing shop after being in business for quite some time. So Bud the barber, I've been seeing him since I was a young man, of some 9 years old. So I go in to see Bud this afternoon, and I spend $20 on a haircut. So from my point of view, that's $20 worth of expenditures. It's $20 worth of spending on a final services. From Bud's point of view, from the barber's point of view, it's $20 worth of income. If you're the good old U.S. government, you don't care, right, which way we measure it. We can either add up the money spent on final goods and services, the expenditures approach, or the income generated from producing those same services, right? It's $20 worth of economic activity either way you slice it, right? No pun intended with the haircut, right? So you go down to the good old $3 car wash this weekend, and you drop a whopping $3 on a car wash. It's $3 worth of expenditure for you. It's $3 worth of income to the car wash business, and to the government, it's $3 worth of economic activity. So the expenditures approach or the income approach. Most of our concentration will be utilizing what's called the expenditures approach. So the one on the left here, the expenditures approach, is by far more important to our study of macroeconomics, and you will see why as we go through various other lessons of GDP and economic growth and then fiscal and monetary policy, why this particular approach has much more application and more value to our investigation into macroeconomic topics. But the income approach has value as well. Without it, we couldn't measure a few key statistics that we're interested in, and we'll get to those later. Okay, so we said that the expenditures approach, C plus I plus G plus X, remember I said this is the alphabet soup chapter, right, is far more interesting and important to our investigation of macroeconomic topics. So we're going to concentrate our efforts in learning and utilizing this particular approach to measuring economic activity. But what do these four components of spending mean, right? So C is consumer expenditures, consumption expenditures. C for consumers. So remember, right, economics is a social science, and the society is broken up into the private sector and the public sector. So households / individuals, right, the I guess we'll call that purplish, right, households there. Right, we spend money on goods and services, right, so that's C. And then I is gross business investment, right? So the other part of the private sector of the economy. Businesses spend money on machines and equipment and such. And then G, government spending. All right, we'll talk about what type of government spending is included and what's not included. And then foreign spending on exports. So that's actually going to be what we call net exports. Net exports. So GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X. Let's investigate each one of these four components in more detail. So if GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X, let's start with C. C is for cookie. It's good enough for me. Cookie, cookie, cookie starts with personal consumption expenditures. No time for Sesame Street. Okay, so personal consumption expenditures. Look at this. Household spending, individuals, households, right? They spend, 70% of GDP. This is by far the biggest component of GDP. So when we break down total spending of the four components, personal consumption expenditures are by far the largest and probably therefore the most important, right? Well, we'll get into that a little bit more later, but definitely we are a consumer-driven economy. So there's three types of consumption expenditures: durable goods, non-durable goods, and services. Now, services is the largest component of consumption expenditures. So within that 70% of GDP, right, total consumption expenditures, services represents about 61 cents or greater on everything we spend, right? So let's go over that one first, even though it's listed last. People tend to overlook services. The big ones are things that we kind of don't want to spend for sometimes, like healthcare services, right? Dental services, getting your car repaired. Now, of course, some of these are luxury services like airline services and, I don't know, going to the spa, that's a service. Joining the gym, I know it's, people don't like to work out sometimes, but you're supposed to do it. It's healthy, that's a service. But by far, we spend more money on services than we do on goods. We are a service-based economy. Okay, so what's the difference between durable goods and non-durable goods? Durable goods are goods that are supposed to last longer and are big ticket items. Your new washing machine or your refrigerator or new furniture or a new high-tech television and stereo system for your house, right? So these are big ticket items and they tend to last longer. Non-durable goods are things that don't last all that long, typically less than a year. Those are things that we purchase regularly. So shampoo, toothpaste, right, toilet paper, soap, t-shirts, right? We go through these things. Of those two, durable goods spending is more important to the overall health of the economy for two reasons. Number one, they're big ticket items, and for a reasonable amount of time, people can postpone the purchase of durable goods. So if you have a washing machine and it's not the greatest, but it's still working and you're not altogether happy with your financial and economic outlook, you might say, hey, this is good enough for now. If you're just crushing it and things are happy-go-lucky and you're doing really well, you say, yeah, I'm one of those new high-tech washing machines that tells me when it's time to get soap because it's so hard to remember when you need laundry detergent. Okay, so what about the next component? Gross business investment. I, little g next to that I. Now we just say C plus G plus X. So you usually don't say C plus I subscript G plus G plus X. So C plus I plus G plus X. But no, I stands for gross business investment. Now, this one is 16% of GDP or thereabouts. These numbers change slightly from year to year, but this gives you a good ballpark figure. I tried to look up the most recent data in 2016 to come up with these numbers. Now, before we talk about what's included, think about why gross business investment is important. Why is it so important to track how much investment spending is taking place? How much money businesses are putting into new machines and equipment and manufactured aids and tools and computer systems and new factories and new warehouses. Obviously, these drive economic activity and employment. So gross business investment tends to ebb and flow with the overall health of the economy, and it drives our economic growth to some extent. Okay, so what's counted, what's not counted? Okay, machinery, equipment, and tools. So obviously, if I own an accounting firm and I say, hey, we're all getting new laptops because we need them to crank out our tax returns, Even if I just purchase software for my firm and my 22 employees, that is the type of spending that will be included. Large pieces of equipment. So if you think of, like, I don't know, when Chrysler purchases a $25 million stamping machine, which presses the chassis of the automobile onto the frame, right? That is a huge piece of spending, and that would be counted towards GDP under the gross business investment part of spending. But any type of spending by a business on a manufactured tool or aid is counted towards the investment component of GDP, right? Now, before we get into this next one, machinery, equipment, and tools, before we get into all construction, one more point about machinery, equipment, and tools. It does not matter if it's spending on new machines and equipment or refurbishing older equipment and tools. As long as it takes place in the year we are trying to measure, it's counted towards that year's GDP. Okay, now all construction, whether residential or commercial. So here in the great city of Philadelphia, Comcast is erecting the second tower, the Comcast building. No wonder my cable bill keeps going up in price, right? Because they keep putting skyscrapers up, right? So that type of construction, you can understand, oh, that makes sense, right? A business is purchasing a new building. That's construction. That's counted towards the investment component of the expenditures approach. But so is residential construction. Here's why. Because the Bureau of Economic Analysis decided years ago that some people rent out houses, and therefore that seems to fit better under the investment component of the expenditures approach. And all houses have the potential of being rented, so therefore all construction, whether residential or commercial, counts towards the investment component of GDP. Now, remember we said that GDP measures what? It's a monetary measure of all final goods and services produced, not necessarily consumed, within the domestic borders of the United States, for as long as the production takes place here in the good old US of A. But let's investigate that produced, not necessarily consumed piece of the puzzle. So our example earlier was a furniture company produces $5.25 million worth of high-end upscale dining room furniture. So if that production takes place in 2015, we would absolutely positively, without a doubt, add increases in inventory to the year it was produced. So any additions into inventories, if that furniture goes into inventory and is not sold until the following year, that's added to GDP. When the furniture is taken out of inventory, so a year later, maybe 2 years later, and sold, that would be subtracted from GDP. So it's a matching principle, the idea that we want to match the production to when it actually took place. So changes in inventory are captured here under the I component of gross domestic product, the expenditures approach. Now, what about these non-investment transactions? They would not be counted. So obviously, if a company does a stock buyback, right, that would not be counted, right? If a company issues more debt, let's say Walmart says, hey, we'd like to raise $400 million by offering bonds for people to purchase, and we'll pay them interest on the bonds. That would not be counted because it's not any type of really economic activities. It falls under that financial transaction. Okay. Now this next slide is important. It harkens back to our study of the production possibility frontier, our production possibility curve, the production possibilities model. And when we investigate what is a nation's capacity to produce, what is the nation's capacity to produce, and what we're going to do is we're going to measure what's called net private domestic investment. So what do we mean here by this idea of net investment? All right. So we already explained what gross investment is, right? The amount of money that businesses spend on new machines and equipment and tools and and such, right? Any manufactured aid, or refurbishing older equipment, right? But if you think about what happens during the year with any type of economic activity, whether any type of manufacturing or any type of economic activity that involves machines, there's going to be some what we call depreciation. In other words, some of those machines or part of those machines or the life cycle of that machine is going to diminish. In other words, there's going to be depreciation. It's going to wear out. Now, remember in the beginning of the term we said sometimes economists use these fancy definitions or terms a little bit differently than the average everyday person. So if you're reading the book and you read it says consumption of fixed capital. To an economist, consumption of fixed capital and depreciation mean the same darn thing. So we can either say gross business investment minus depreciation or gross business investment minus consumption of fixed capital. The depreciation and consumption of fixed capital, they both mean how much machines, equipment, tools, factories, how much of that stuff was used up or how much was worn out during 1 year. All right. So let's look on the chart down here, right, to talk about how we calculate net investment. So look at January 1st. Let's assume this is January 1st, 2014. All right, it says stock of capital. It means the nation's stock of capital. What is capital? Well, it's a resource. It's what type of resource? Well, it's all the manufactured aids and tools that are used in the production process. Now, this is going to sound like a large number, but the United States is a capital-intensive, capital-rich country. So, roughly, this is a rough number here. All right, and this is a pretty accurate number. The United States collectively, now remember, private ownership of economic resources. So these are small, medium-sized, and large businesses that owns $45 trillion worth of capital. So if you were to go out and add up the effective value of all the machines, all the tools, all the equipment, right, all the software, all the technology, I mean, you think about like FedEx and UPS and Walmart, right, and all these companies, they have all these technology and machines and such, right? And then all the other small companies. We have roughly $45 trillion worth of machines and tools and equipment in this country. So let's assume that's an accurate measure, that's an accurate number. That's our stock of capital at the beginning of the year in 2014. Now, three things can happen during the year, right? The nation's stock of capital can rise, the nation's stock of capital could decrease, or the nation's stock of capital could be stagnant. So if he says, look in the middle column, it says increase, decrease, or static. So two things are happening during the year. There's obviously gross business investment, right? There's gross business investment. In other words, businesses are definitely purchasing new machines, equipment, and refurbishing old equipment. And we got that construction going on, right? But machines are also being worn out. So at the end of the year, the nation's stock of capital could be greater than $45 trillion. It could be less than $45 trillion, or it could be exactly $45 trillion. Why is this so important? Why do we care about measuring net investment year over year? Well, remember, economics is all about doing the best with the least, right? So if we have more economic resources, it's going to be a source of economic growth. The production possibilities curve would shift to the right. And if the nation's stock of capital decreases, if we have fewer manufacturing facilities and tools and equipment and such, the nation's production possibility curve would shift inward. Our capacity to produce would decrease. And if it doesn't increase or decrease, right, if our stock of capital remains the same, well, then we're just stagnant. We're not really doing any better. So let's go over a real world example. In the time period known as the Great Depression, especially during the first four years from 1929 to 1933, they were the absolute worst years. You know, it got bad again after a year of a little bit of reprieve, or 18 months of reprieve. But the nation's stock of capital fell by 50%. So imagine living in a country where our economic production capacity actually was cut in half. So now you understand why this is such an important number to measure. And even if you look at the numbers during the 2008/9 recession, our nation's stock of capital fell by a bit, right? And that's why it was a pretty severe recession. So this idea of measuring stock of capital, it's a pretty important idea. It's a pretty powerful economic concept. At the end of this slide, it assumes that the nation's stock of capital increased, and that's the typical situation where the nation's stock of capital actually does rise a little bit each year. So if we're talking about, from 2014 to 2015, maybe the nation's stock of capital went up by $250 billion, right? Over 10 years, hopefully it goes up by another $5 trillion. Now, what about government expenditures? Well, we kind of went into this before, but first, government expenditures are 18% of the total economic spending in the economy from the expenditures approach, right? Government expenditures represent 18% of GDP. And again, that's a rough number. It changes a little bit, but it's a pretty accurate number. It's the one from 2016, okay? So expenditures on goods and services, as long as the spending is what we call exhaustive. So what does the government spend money on? Right? Military spending is the big one, right? But then things like bridges and roads and schools, right? Now remember, we have the federal government, but we also have state and local governments, and believe it or not, state and local government spending actually exceeds federal spending, right? So as long as the spending is exhaustive, if it's on things like social capital, like parks and roads and bridges and such, right, then it is counted towards GDP. So again, military spending is the biggest one, the biggest component of government spending that's actually counted. But what do we not count? We already mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. Right? Transfer payments, purely financial transactions, do not count towards gross domestic product. So welfare checks, unemployment checks, Social Security checks, those are purely financial transactions. That is not a normative statement. That's a positive statement. Those people absolutely positively, without a doubt, deserve their check. But if we added in the amount of money the government spends on that type of transfer payments, we would be overstating gross domestic product by a very large number. All right, it's just not a productive activity. All right, the final piece here are net exports. Net exports. So first, right, what are we talking about here? Well, the United States exports a large number of goods and services per year, and the United States imports a large number of goods and services per year, right, in the billions and billions of dollars. So what we do is we first add in all of the goods and services produced here in the United States, which are purchased by people in other countries, exports, and then we subtract out goods and services purchased by Americans, which were produced in other countries. Those are called imports. So exports were 12% of GDP in 2016. Now this should make sense, right? Because the United States has a trade deficit. So imports were actually 15% of gross domestic product in 2016. So therefore, the United States had a trade deficit, right, of $550 billion. That's the numbers. In other words, we had a $550 billion trade deficit, or it was a negative 3%. So we look to see that 2016 net, right, because net exports, it was a net negative number of 3%. Negative 3%. So if we put it all together, right, C plus I plus G, that could just be as well stated minus X, right, because that's a negative number. But remember how important this expenditures approach is. We're going to be employing this approach throughout the remainder of our study of macroeconomics, including economic growth and aggregate supply and aggregate demand and fiscal monetary policy. So therefore, this expenditures approach not only does it have value to help us understand how we add it all up, it has application to the remainder of our economic study of the macro picture.